Pardon. The fallen gentleman on the morning of June 26, 1830, the once glittering crown of Britain, sat upon a body that was no longer fit for kingship. George IV was dead, but long before that moment he had ceased to truly live. The man once hailed as the first gentleman of England had become a grotesque parody of monarchy, bloated, drugged, stinking of decay, and despised by his people. Servants whispered of his stench, visitors recoiled at the sight of his swollen flesh, and even those who owed him their positions secretly wished for the end. Death did not rob England of a king, it released it from a burden. This is not merely the story of a royal demise, but of a life that unraveled spectacularly in the public eye. George IV was born into privilege, charm, and promise. He had every advantage: wit, beauty, education, and the admiration of high society. Yet his journey ended in shame, his name synonymous not with triumph, but with excess and humiliation. His death became a parable, a grotesque warning of what happens when indulgence devours discipline, and vanity strangles dignity. The newspapers of the day did not soften the truth. The Times summed up the mood with brutal clarity. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? Rarely had the passing of a king been met with so little grief. Instead of mourning, there was relief and almost guilty exhalation from a nation weary of being chained to a monarch who had long lost his dignity. Yet, to understand how such a fall was possible, one must first see the heights from which he descended. For George Augustus Frederick did not begin life as a figure of ridicule. In his youth, he embodied everything Britain could desire in a prince, strikingly handsome, eloquent, and magnetic in company. Society adored him. Women swooned at his charm, men envied his style, and artists praised his wit and taste. It was as though destiny had placed in his hands the possibility of greatness. But greatness was not what George sought. Where his father, George III, clung to morality, thrift, and duty, the young prince longed for freedom, indulgence, and pleasure. The seeds of ruin were sown early, hidden beneath a polished exterior. The story that follows is not just about a king's death. It is about a man who transformed himself, piece by piece, from golden heir to living corpse. His final hours were only the last act of a tragedy already long in motion. Stop. Part 2. Prince of Promise, Prisoner of Desire. George Augustus Frederick entered the world on August 12, 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. From the moment of his birth, he seemed destined for greatness. With the blood of kings in his veins and the weight of empire awaiting his shoulders, the child was Britain's hope for continuity. Those who saw him grow into boyhood found much to admire. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed a natural charm that set him apart. Tutors praised his quick wit, and his striking looks made him the very model of a prince. To the outside world, his future seemed gilded with promise. But within the royal household, life was far from indulgent. George III, devout and stern, ruled his family with the same rigid morality with which he ruled his court. Piety, discipline, and frugality were the principles impressed upon the young heir. His father believed that only through strict moral guidance could a prince be shaped into a true king. Yet the young George chafed under such confinement. The polished halls of the palace felt more like prison walls, and the weight of expectation pressed upon him like iron chains. The boy who sparkled in society's drawing rooms grew restless within his father's shadow. To George, the sermons on restraint felt suffocating, and the endless lessons in virtue were cages. He longed for freedom, not simply the freedom of movement, but of indulgence, of living life without constant judgment. In that longing lay the seeds of his undoing. For when freedom did come, he seized it not with measured hands, but with an appetite as boundless as it was reckless. At the age of 21, he established himself at Carlton House, a grand residence on London's Pall Mall. It became more than a home. It was a stage upon which the prince could play out his desires. Here, the transformation from dutiful heir to indulgent libertine began in earnest. Where George III valued thrift, George IV, the Prince of Wales, as he was then embraced, extravagance. He surrounded himself with companions who encouraged his vices, men who drank as heavily as he did, women who delighted in scandal, and artists who flattered his vanity. Carlton House quickly became infamous. Its doors opened to reckless nights of feasting, gambling, and affairs that mocked the rigid morality of his father's court. London's satirical press, always hungry for scandal, found endless fodder in the young prince's exploits. To the public he was both dazzling and dangerous, a man whose charm made his excesses entertaining. To his father, he was already a disappointment. The world that had once looked upon him with hope now began to see the cracks forming. What had begun as youthful rebellion was becoming a way of life. The prince had found his freedom, but freedom was proving to be his most treacherous prison. The young prince's rebellion soon grew into something grotesque. By the mid-1780s, his appetite had already become legendary. Breakfast at Carlton House might consist of 2 roasted pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, a bottle of white wine, champagne, port, and brandy, all before the day had properly begun. If this was merely the prologue, his lunches and dinners were full-scale Roman banquets. Guests marveled at the spectacle, but behind the glitter was a stomach stretched beyond reason, and debts stretched even further. For indulgence was never cheap. By the 1790s, George owed staggering sums to London's merchants and moneylenders. His obsession with jewels, silks, fine wines, and endless furniture meant that the Prince of Britain, heir to an empire, was constantly drowning in personal debt. Parliament intervened again and again, bailing him out to preserve royal dignity, only to watch him squander more. To many Britons, the monarchy itself seemed hostage to his appetites. And if his table was the site of ruin, his heart offered little stability. In 1785, George secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic. The union was forbidden by law. Catholics could not marry heirs to the throne, and it threatened to ignite constitutional crisis. Though invalid in the eyes of church and state, George treated Maria as his wife, flaunting her before courtiers who whispered of scandal. The press, ever watchful, painted him as a reckless libertine willing to endanger the monarchy for desire. But even that was not the end. 10 years later, duty forced him into marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick. If the Fitzherbert marriage was illegal, this one was disastrous. Their first meeting was a comedy of insults. George recoiled at Caroline's lack of refinement, demanding brandy to steady his nerves, while she dismissed him as very fat and far less attractive than his portraits suggested. Their wedding night ended in farce, with the groom drunk and sprawled unconscious before the fireplace. The marriage quickly collapsed into mutual hatred. Caroline mocked George publicly, while George treated her with cruelty and disdain. Their quarrels spilled into the public arena, fueling the satire of London's cartoonists, who gleefully depicted the royal couple as grotesque caricatures of marital failure. The supposed dignity of Britain's heir had become a carnival show of scandal, played out in newspapers and gossip salons alike. George's life was already spiraling into excess, but his greatest enemy was not only the ridicule of the public, it was his own body, which would soon betray him in ways more terrible than satire ever could. By the late 1790s, the once handsome prince, who had captivated salons and ballrooms, was scarcely recognizable. Years of feasting, drinking, and restless indulgence had reshaped him into a figure both bloated and pitiable. At just 35, George already weighed around 245 pounds, a staggering size for the age. His jawline, once admired in portraits, disappeared beneath folds of flesh. His body sagged with the marks of gluttony. Yet vanity ruled him still. Corsets of whalebone squeezed his swelling stomach, rouge and powder disguised his pallor, and elaborate wigs attempted to crown what nature was swiftly eroding. It was a losing battle. Every mirror reflected decay, but every disguise told him he was still the prince of elegance. Despite this decline, fate offered him a throne of sorts. In 1811, as his father King George III succumbed to madness, George was declared Prince Regent. For nearly a decade, Britain was effectively ruled by a man whose health faltered as quickly as his judgment. Yet, to society the regency glittered. George poured money into architecture, fashion, and the arts. He championed the flamboyant Brighton Pavilion, transformed Windsor Castle, and presided over endless seasons of balls and opera. London sparkled with his touch, and in culture, he seemed every inch a Renaissance prince. But brilliance always concealed rot. Behind the dazzling F80s of Carlton House and Brighton lay a man addicted to indulgence. His drinking, already notorious, grew worse. Bottles of port, claret, and champagne disappeared daily into his grasp, leaving him dazed and incoherent. More sinister still was his reliance on laudanum liquid opium. At first, prescribed for pain and nerves, it soon became his constant companion, dulling not just his body but his mind. Guests at his banquets whispered that the regent often slurred his words, or slipped into stupors as dancers twirled around him. And those banquets, they had grown monstrous. In a mere 6 weeks of 1816, records show more than 5,000 pounds of meat delivered to Carlton House, not counting poultry, sausages, or wine. The regent's table was a grotesque theater, where excess was applauded and moderation mocked. He gorged himself before hundreds, then collapsed into near unconsciousness, while society pretended not to notice. To the outside world, Britain's Prince Regent was a symbol of grandeur, patron of the arts, a connoisseur of beauty. But to those who saw behind the curtains, he was already a ruin in motion, his body a prison, his habits a noose tightening with every year. His coronation as king would come, but the throne he ascended was already soaked in scandal and decay. In January 1820, the Prince Regent finally became king. After decades of waiting, George IV ascended the throne, yet his long-anticipated coronation was no triumph. The ceremony, meant to dazzle Britain and the world, instead became a grotesque spectacle. Draped in robes of silver tissue, his immense body squeezed into finery, he glittered beneath more than 12,000 rented diamonds. Observers compared him not to a sovereign, but to a magnificent whale at a masquerade. The very extravagance that was supposed to command awe only invited ridicule. The political stage offered him little redemption. George's obsession with divorcing his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, consumed his early reign. He tried to bar her from his coronation, an act so vindictive it outraged the public. When Caroline died suddenly in 1821, many whispered that the relentless persecution she endured had hastened her end. For George, this was no victory, only another nail in the coffin of his reputation. His meddling in government revealed how unfit he was to rule. Unlike his father, who at least tried to steer the affairs of state with discipline, George blundered like an amateur. Ministers quickly learned that the king's attention wandered, his memory failed, and his judgment was clouded by drink and opium. Parliament began to treat him not as a leader, but as an obstacle to be managed, a monarch whose signature was required but whose voice carried no weight. Meanwhile, his health collapsed under the weight of years of indulgence. By the late 1820s, his legs were grotesquely swollen with fluid. Stairs were impossible. He could not walk without being carried by servants who loathed their duties. Blindness clouded his eyes, gout twisted his limbs, and his flesh ballooned into folds that oozed infection. He could not even bear to lie in a bed, forced instead to doze in a specially built chair propped with pillows, gasping for air between mouthfuls of rich food. The contrast between image and reality was surreal. Official portraits continued to depict him as regal, draped in robes and jewels, while behind palace doors he resembled little more than a living corpse. The whispers of courtiers grew louder, servants complained openly, and the public no longer feared their king, they mocked him. The monarchy, once shrouded in reverence, was reduced to a theater of shame, its leading actor a man crumbling before the eyes of his nation. By the twilight of his reign, George IV had become a prisoner of his own addictions. Laudanum liquid opium flowed into his veins daily, consumed in such staggering doses that what might kill another man barely dulled his pain. Before public appearances, he swallowed over 100 drops, enough to cloud his mind into slurred rambling or send him drifting into incoherence. Combined with oceans of wine and champagne, the effect was catastrophic. Diplomats whispered that England was ruled by a king who was either drunk, drugged, or both. The consequences went beyond his body. His mind, once witty and quick, dissolved into delusion. He swung wildly between paranoid rages and tearful breakdowns. He accused servants of mocking him, often correctly, and flew into fits of fury when confronted with the truth of his decline. At other times, he would babble about battles he had never fought, claiming heroism at Waterloo, a fantasy grotesque in its irony, given that the man could no longer walk without being carried. Religion, which he had long mocked, suddenly became an obsession. In his final years he summoned clergymen to his chambers, pouring out grotesque confessions that stretched for hours. The man who had spent decades chasing pleasure now begged for absolution, his guilt as vast as his body. Priests left his bedside shaken, not by reverence, but by the raw, pathetic desperation of a monarch clinging to forgiveness he could never truly believe in. Meanwhile, his household crumbled into open disdain. Footmen complained of carrying him like a sack of meat. Maids gossiped about the stench that clung to his rooms, a foul mix of infected flesh and unwashed folds that no perfume could mask. Doctors despaired. When they spoke truth, George dismissed them. When they offered comfort, he demanded lies. Reality was never welcome at Windsor. Outside the palace, caricaturists sharpened their pens. The satirical press, which had once mocked his gluttony, now portrayed him as a corpse in waiting, a bloated shadow of monarchy. Parliament managed the state without him, and politicians quietly prepared for his brother William to inherit the throne. It was as if the crown itself had grown weary of George's existence. The monarchy, once wrapped in divine aura, seemed to rot alongside his flesh. Where kings were meant to inspire awe, George provoked disgust. Where kings embodied stability, George embodied collapse. By the late 1820s, the King of England had ceased to be a ruler at all. He was a spectacle of decay, a grotesque reminder that power without discipline becomes its own form of ruin. By 1830, George IV was more carcass than king. His body had swollen to such enormity that simple movements became ordeals. He could not ascend stairs, nor lie flat in a bed. His bulk crushed his lungs and heart, forcing him to sleep upright in a chair propped with pillows. Each breath rattled from him in wheezing gasps, a grotesque soundtrack to his final decline. His legs ballooned with dropsy, his hands distorted by gout, his eyesight clouded until he was nearly blind. Servants dreaded entering his chambers, not for awe of the crown, but for the fetid stench that clung to every surface. Yet even in this pitiful state, his appetites raged on. He demanded elaborate dinners of rich meats and heavily spiced dishes, choking down food between gasps for air. Watching him eat became a spectacle of horror. A king gorging himself while visibly suffocating, his flesh collapsing into folds that oozed sores. Wine and laudanum accompanied every meal, his tolerance so terrifying that physicians diluted his doses in secret to prevent him from killing himself outright. The nights were worse. George refused to sleep, terrified that slumber would mean death. Servants were forced to sit with him through endless vigils, enduring incoherent ramblings fueled by opium and despair. His paranoia deepened. He believed his attendants mocked him, and often they did. Lots were drawn among staff to decide who would endure the misery of his nocturnal company. For those in Windsor, royal service had devolved into torment. By June of that year, it was clear the end was near. His physicians, helpless, prepared for the inevitable. On the evening of June 25th, his condition worsened sharply. His skin turned ashen, his breathing grew shallow, and his massive body trembled under the effort of staying alive. Still, he clung to denial, insisting on remedies, praying for recovery. The empire watched anxiously, though not with grief, rather with impatience for his departure. At 3 o'clock on the morning of June 26th, the suffering reached its climax. George collapsed into a massive internal hemorrhage, blood flooding his bowels. His final conscious act was to cry out desperately for his physician, Sir Henry Halford. Minutes later, at 3:15 a.m., George IV's tortured breathing ceased. The once dazzling prince, who had lived as if appetite were destiny, died not with dignity, but with the grotesque collapse of a man consumed by his own indulgence. Death, for most kings, brings a measure of solemnity, crowds in mourning, tributes of loyalty, histories softened by sympathy. For George IV, it brought only relief. When news of his passing spread across London, there were no waves of grief, no tears shed in the streets. Instead, the city seemed to exhale, as though unshackled from years of embarrassment. The Times delivered an obituary with savage precision. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? Rarely had a monarch been condemned so openly in death. The indignities did not end with his last breath. His enormous corpse posed a challenge even in burial. Undertakers were forced to build a special coffin of reinforced mahogany lined with lead, heavy enough to damage palace floors as it was moved. His body, already decomposing, exuded a stench so revolting that embalmers struggled to mask it. For a man who had once drenched himself in perfumes and powders, this was the ultimate insult, to be remembered not for elegance, but for decay. His funeral, held at St. George's Chapel, was a spectacle devoid of reverence. Protocol demanded black clothing and solemn hymns, but the atmosphere was restless, even mocking. Courtiers whispered jokes. The public came not to mourn but to gawk, and even his own brother William betrayed unseemly eagerness for the crown he was about to inherit. Compared with the genuine grief that had followed his father, George III, his farewell was an embarrassment, the final act in a life of wasted grandeur. Historians have since struggled to salvage his reputation. Yes, George IV left cultural footprints: the exotic fantasy of the Brighton Pavilion, the transformation of Windsor Castle, his patronage of the arts. But these achievements were dwarfed by his legacy of scandal, waste, and humiliation. The Duke of Wellington, Britain's most respected statesman, delivered the bluntest epitaph. "He was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life. The most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality." In the end, George IV is remembered less as a monarch and more as a grotesque parable. A golden heir who squandered every gift, a man who transformed charm into corruption, promise into pity. His life warns of the dangers of unchecked indulgence, of power without restraint. He died as he lived, consumed by appetite, abandoned by his people, mocked by history. And in that final mockery lies the truth. The crown may magnify a man, but it cannot redeem him.